Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the January 2025 English Language Arts Regents Exam. In this video, we're going to be tackling passage B from part 1, which is going to be the poem passage, okay? So if you didn't know, this is a part of a bigger series where I'm going to go over every single reading comprehension passage from this exam. So the videos going over passage A and C have already been uploaded. You can find them in the description of this video. In this case, we're going to go over passage B, which is the poem. So this video is all about poems. That being said, we're going to go ahead and read the poem, right? It's called Seadrift, and it says that they would sit, two or three of them as a rule, on the cast iron seat they called a form, that stood at the end of the road to the sea, where it petered out into a dirt track through a salt marsh, disappeared in the sand. Old men now, dark clothes and rough work boots worn from habit, faces scarred by wind and sun for days on the boats, stranded somehow in this place as if, like seaweed, they had washed up on the shore at high tide, survivors from a world once theirs. Somewhere in a nearby stone cottage, with modern extensions at the back and sides to accommodate indoor plumbing, were daughters or daughters-in-law keeping house, cooking meals, expecting the men home at appointed times. This was the daily routine now. Out of the doors, they were free to rejoice in the weather and tides, smell sea air that was the smell of life, salt, seaweed, sour mud, dead fish, churned up sand, to feel the whip of wind on their skin, gulls circling and swooping in the wide skies, diving, as they once did, above the shrimp boats, as heavy nets were cast into sea. The slow pace of nature's change gave them some peace. All right, this is a poem called Seadrift. All right, so what happened in this poem? Essentially, what I read in this poem is that there's these men who used to be at sea, right? We don't know if they, were castaways or if they just worked at sea, but at some point, that was their profession and that was their life, right? Now, they've turned old, and as a result, they've lost their habits for the sea, right? They still have a passion and a love for the sea, but they no longer interact with it in the same way that they did before. Now they have real lives and jobs, and they have daughters, and they have to be home at a certain time, but sometimes they can escape, right? Sometimes they can escape back into the sea to enjoy the things that they really love. But again, their actual time on the water is behind them, right? They can only get a glimpse or a taste of what once was. That's essentially what I've read from here, okay? This first stanza right here was talking about their when they were younger, their prior life at sea. Now this talks about the present, when they're old. They carry the scars of their old seafaring days, but now they are in this stanza. Now they're saying that they are with their daughters, with their families at home, no longer at sea. They're expected to be home at some sort. They live somewhat more dull lives. And finally, this final stanza is talking about how sometimes they can get an escape back into their old lives. They can get a taste of what it once was like. All right, so let's go ahead and let's look at these questions. Number 10 asks, the term petered out in line 3 most nearly means what? Okay, let's look at line 3. It says that where it petered out in a dirt track through the salt marsh. All right, so first of all, let's get this word in the real sentence, right? Not just in the middle of nowhere. So the actual sentence that this is a part of starts up here. It says, they would sit, two or three of them as a rule, on the cast iron seat they called a form, that stood at the end of the road to the sea, where it petered out into a dark track through salt marsh and disappeared in the sand. All right, so if something is petering out and then disappearing, it kind of sounds like it's fading away, which is why it's going to be choice 3, right? Think about it this way. The path petered out in a dirt, right? The road is what we're talking about here. So the road petered out into a dirt track. So we're going from a paved road onto a dirt track, and as this dirt track is continuing, it's disappearing, right? So if something is petering out and then disappearing, it's probably fading out or diminishing, all right? And diminishing, fading, same thing as saying dwindled, all right? If something is dwindling, it's decreasing in its amount until it disappears, which is what happened to that road. Right? Carried on is false, because if the road carried on, it wouldn't have disappeared in the sands. Branched off is also false, because if it branched off, they would have said that the road branched off instead of turning into sand. All right. Dipped slightly, again, they would have said that it dipped slightly, not disappear. That's why choice 4 is wrong. Number 11 asks, the figurative language in lines 7 and 8 conveys the men's blank. All right, so let's look at 7 through 8. So here's 6, here's 7. Stranded somehow in this place, as if, like seaweed, they had washed upon a shore at high tide. Right, so this is describing how the old men are now. It says that they're old men now, dark clothes and rough work boots worn from habit, faces scarred by the wind and sun from the old days out on the boat. stranded somehow in this place as if like seaweed they had washed up on a shore at high tide. Right? So all of a sudden they're in this place, and obviously this place is no longer at sea. And just comparing their existence in a on land, right, with their families or on this island or whatever they are right now, they're comparing that to seaweed on land. Now, where does seaweed usually belong? Seaweed belongs in the sea. So just like these men belong at the water or in the ocean where they're happy, they're just like a seaweed that has been washed up on a beach, right? It's in a place that it no longer wants to be in. Okay, so which choice kind of reflects that? Obviously, it's going to be choice one. It's a lack of purpose, right? Why am I on land if I'm meant to be on the sea? If you're washed up, that means that you're not where you want to be. It's not where you need to be. And as a result, you feel a lack of purpose, right? It's not a feeling of obligation, because really the figurative language here is the comparison to seaweed. If, like seaweed, they had washed up on a shore at high tide, if you're washed up, you don't have a purpose anymore, right? Your days are over, your days are done. Okay, so it's not a loss of companionship because the men still have each other, right? They're still friends. And if it was a sense of control, then they wouldn't have been washed up. If anything, this being compared to a piece of seaweed that was just washed up on the shore makes you feel hopeless and not in control, right? Something bigger controls you. The waves control you. So it's the opposite of them being in control. Number 12 says the men are most likely called survivors in line 9 because they have done what? Right, so let's look at line 9. Right, stranded somehow in this place as if like seaweed they had washed up on a shore at high tide. And here's line 9. It says survivors from a world once theirs. So if you're a survivor, it probably means something bad happened to you, right? If you survived something, it doesn't just mean you lived through it, right? You lived through something that's really bad. Otherwise, we wouldn't say survive, right? It's not like, oh, I survived yesterday when all I did was go to bed and wake up, or wake up and go to bed. You wouldn't say that, right? You would say I survived an attack by a dog, or like, I survived a plane crash, because something bad needs to happen for you to be considered a survivor from something, right? So what's that reasoning? Well, obviously because they had endured past adversity, right? Adversity is a challenge. If you faced adversity and you came out alive, you survived something, right? If you dominated a new competition, guess what? You didn't survive, you dominated it, right? If you settled in a location, you didn't survive. If you settled in a new location, you just started a new home, right? Settling has nothing to do with surviving, and finding safer employment, again, has nothing to do with surviving, right? If you're a survivor, you overcame a challenge. Adversity is just a synonym for challenge. It's a word that means challenge. Okay, number 13 says the repetition of the word once in lines 9 and 18 supports a central idea about what? Okay, so let's look at where they say once. So line 9 says they were a survivor from a world that was once theirs. Okay, and finally the other line is in 18, right? So line 18. Gulls circling and swooping the wide skies, diving as they once did. Okay, so if something once happened, or happened once, is it happening to you right now? No, it's not happening to you right now. So, like I said when I talked about what I think this work is about, these men are no longer at water. They're no longer at sea. And this entire poem is talking about their prior experience, right? Their old life that they had to move on from. They once did this, they once did that, they once did this, but now they're old, right? Now they're just like seaweed in a land that's not theirs, right? Doing something that they can't do because of their old age, right? Or because they just simply can't do it anymore. So this word of once kind of convinces or conveys this meaning of time being past, essentially, right? Because if they didn't place once here, it would be impossible to know that these men are no longer at sea and that they've started a new life. So which choice supports that something has already happened to them? Well, aging, right? I once was, strong. I once knew how to ride a bike. I once knew how to run really quickly. Well, what happened? Well, I got old, right? They're reminiscing on their old lives. And if for you to reminisce or for you to remember something, you have to have been older, or you have to have moved on from that moment. So they don't have to be extremely old, but they have to have been aged, right? Or they have to be older than how they were when they were still working in the water. Right, so that's why choice 3 has to be the right answer. Again, it's not confusion. These men are aware of the lives they used to live. They're not confused about it. Nor is it forgiveness. They're not forgiving people for taking away the life or their previous lives. They're not forgiving you or asking for forgiveness. I'm sorry, I really used to like, being a sailor and whatnot. Not asking for that. And it's not regret either. This was a very common choice that a lot of students would have picked here. But again, once doesn't mean regret. If only, if they were, if instead of saying once, they were saying, oh, if only I stayed, if only I did this, if only I did that, sure, that would be regret. But once something has happened, again, that's showing the passage of time, essentially. That tells us that they're looking back on something that happened a while ago, right, in the past tense. Okay, so number 14 says, which phrase supports a central idea? All right, so again, the central idea has to be, the main point that the author is driving here. And that's the fact that they're no longer sailors, right? They still have the memories, they still have the marks, but they've started a new life, right? So which one of that says it? The cast iron seat they call the form. Again, not really doesn't have anything to do with starting a new life or remembering an old one, right? That's, if anything, that's just describing a memory that they had. Doesn't have anything to do with the change that these men experienced, right? Choice 2, faces, scarred by wind and sun. Yeah, I would agree, right? Scarred by wind and sun signifies that something has happened to them, right? That they are these survivors, or that, they were once graced by being able to be on the ocean, right? To have a scar means you have gone through something. You have a mark to signify that something has happened to you. And in this case, that was the ocean, okay, for them. And the faces now, guess what? They still keep the faces, right? They're still their own unique people. They carry on, but they also carry the marks of their previous lives, which is exactly what happens here, right? And I don't mean that they were like reincarnated or anything, but just the previous way that they used to live, it still carries on within them as scars, as marks, as memories, but they themselves continue as the same person as before, right? Number 3, or choice 3, is wrong because this isn't about their life in a stone cottage. This is about them reminiscing on their previous life. And finally, gulls circling and swooping, well, that's kind of the opposite of choice 3. Choice 3 focuses on their new life. Choice 4 focuses on their old life. What you really want to do is you want to show that they are still their own people, just with memories of what used to be. All right? And that's the end of this poem passage. So I understand that poems can be a little bit confusing, but at the end of the day, the Regents makes it pretty easy to kind of get the message here. If you have trouble with poems, I always like to take notes, right? I always like to underline as I read. It keeps me more engaged. Okay, and again, the Regents won't throw anything too hard at you. In this case, as long as you understand the general gist of what's happening, you can piece together this this multiple choice section pretty easily. Okay, so for those of you that want me to go over part C, please check that out in the link in the description, right? There's a link to a video that's going over part C and part A. I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you have a nice night.